I think that's a very important question, and a question that people should look at in great detail. Of course, the difficulty with understanding Russian military transformation and reform is that until around about 2014, very few people paid attention to it or actually were interested in these kind of questions. Of course, looking at what Russia did in Crimea, how they did it, and the operational successes and so on are important and tell us something about Russian military transformation. But of course, we cannot just boil everything about Russian military transformation down to 2014 and onwards. So, of course, what we need to look at are factors that go way beyond that, mostly back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. So Russia's military transformation was not only driven by the desire to expand or to annex other countries' territory and so on. Of course, this is what raised the interest in the topic again. But of course, Russia for a very long time, since the early 1990s, was faced with the very difficult situation of having to adjust its armed forces from the ruins of what it inherited from the Red Army that had collapsed into something that was actually relevant and appropriate to face the various security threats or issues that Russia faced. So security, territorial integrity, like for every country's military, always was and remains the number one issue or number one task for the Russian armed forces. There were serious worries in Russia during the 1990s that they had even lost the capability to protect Russia's very long borders. The very poor performance of the Russian armed forces in Chechnya really made the military establishment and political leadership also question whether they had a military that was fit really to protect a large country like that. So security, the very sort of basic issues, is one of the reasons why Russia transformed its military. Of course, there are other reasons as well. Sovereignty often comes into it. Sovereignty has turned into one of the major sort of buzzwords of Russian foreign policy and Russian politics, Putin's politics in particular. Having lost its military capabilities that it had during the Soviet Union and having sort of fallen from sort of the circle of big military powers in the world, Russia really started feeling towards the end of the 1990s that it lost its freedom of international action as a result of having such weak conventional military forces. So there was always the perception that, well, whereas other countries, especially the United States, of course, have continued developing their military power in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, and they could pursue their own foreign policy agenda. Of course, the Kosovo War, NATO's Operation Allied Force, was particularly important there from the Russian point of view, where Russia really had very strong feelings about this. They didn't want this to happen. They saw this very clearly as an assault on who they saw as an ally, Milosevic, and they felt that because of their weakened military, they couldn't really put forward their own point of view. And of course, there were other issues as well, the 2003 war in Iraq, and so on. So transforming the military also to maintain its sovereignty, to maintain its ability to pursue its international actions or freedom of international action was another, mostly, I would say, one of the major reasons for military transformation in Russia. I guess as working on any military, restrictions in terms of things being classified and people not wanting to speak very openly about it affect me as much as anybody else. But of course, this is exacerbated even in Russia. When I started working on this issue around about the turn of the millennium, around 2000, when I did my own PhD, it was still a little bit easier. I went to Russia, we called people up. Either they said yes or no, but I got to speak to some very interesting politicians, officials, and so on. Whether that would still be possible to the same extent today, especially also for PhD students, I'm not so sure. I think it is getting more difficult, especially also as we have heard of sort of Russian analysts and so on being arrested sometimes for doing certain things. I'm not so worried about that. I'm more realistic about who would agree to be interviewed and so on. Apart from that, I think there still is quite a lot of research available. Of course, it depends exactly on the kind of research question you're trying to pursue. But as I'm quite interested in providing the context and looking at the bigger picture, there is a lot you can do, especially if you speak Russian, finding sources that will provide something new and are quite insightful. It's not an easy thing to study, but just because it isn't easy doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Well, it's not the newest book. I know it already has been published, I think, about 5 years ago in 2013. But one I always come back to and that I read and pick up again for almost everything I write is Hugh Strawn's The Direction of War. It is a collection of different articles and different contributions he had made throughout the years. And why I find it so significant, especially also for my own work, is that it really emphasizes the importance of historical context, of history, of taking the long view in terms of understanding contemporary changes in war and warfare and conflict. And this is why I find his work invaluable, and I pretty much made all of my students read it so far.